Chair Detmer, would you like to move your bill, House File 505, that will be re-referred, if passed, to the State Government Finance Committee?
No, get a better chair. Okay.
Chair Detmer, would you like to move your bill, House File 505?
Madam Chair, I'd like to move House File 505 and be referred to State Government Finance.
Thank you. Would you like to present your bill? Chair Detmer, would you like to move your amendment and then speak to the totality of the bill?
If I find the amendment here.
Okay. I believe it's the A170029.
Madam Chair, I move the A17A0029 amendment.
Okay, Chair. And would you like to speak to the amendment, or would you like to just incorporate it and then speak to the bill as in total?
I'd like to just incorporate it.
Okay. Okay. Is there any discussion on the A170029 amendment? Okay, seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. 2-year bill.
Madam Chair, the bill provides over the biennium 700,000 grants to for 2 years of the Veterans Defense Project. And this Veterans Defense Project is a Minnesota-based nonprofit that focuses on defending veterans in court. And Madam Chair, we have some testifiers here, and I would like them to introduce themselves and testify to the bill.
Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and continue with your testimony.
Thank you, Representative O'Neill's members of the committee. My name is Brock Hunter. I am a former Army reconnaissance scout and now an attorney who focuses the bulk of my practice on representing veterans in the criminal court system. I also have been involved in doing a lot of work outside of the court, advocating for veterans in the justice system, and in that capacity, co-founded and am now the president of the Veterans Defense Project. As Representative Detner mentioned, we are a Minnesota-based 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating and advocating for veterans in the criminal court system. I'd be quick to note that our nonprofit does not provide direct representation of veterans, but is dedicated to making sure that our justice system as a whole does a better job this time around with this generation of veterans than we have in the past. In the few years that we've been in existence, examples of our work include helping draft and pass Minnesota's 2008 veteran sentencing statute that made us the second state in the country to have legislation that advocates that veterans receive treatment over incarceration where appropriate when their offenses are related to psychological injuries from military service. The year after we passed our pioneer legislation here in Minnesota, the U.S. Supreme Court cited that legislation in the landmark case of Porter v. McCullum, the first case in our country's history in which the Supreme Court dealt with combat trauma and advocated that it be considered in criminal sentencing. Since then, we have been drafted into helping other states pass similar legislation, and then more recently in helping establish and train veterans treatment courts here in Minnesota as well as around the country. Most recently, we co-authored and edited a legal treatise on defending veterans in criminal court, the only one of its type in the country. And we've been called upon to brief representatives from the White House, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Veterans Affairs on veterans in the criminal court system. We've also trained thousands of attorneys, judges, prosecutors, police officers, probation officers, and mental health professionals across Minnesota and across the country in how to do better with veterans in the criminal court system. A brief overview of the problem that we face in the coming years. As the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have ground on now for 15 years, we have a new generation of veterans returning home from the 2 longest wars in our country's history, fought simultaneously without a draft. And our small, all-voluntary military force has been called upon to serve in a way that no other generation before it has. Many veterans have served multiple deployments in these wars. Marko Milosevic, who you'll hear from here very shortly, served 12 combat deployments as an Army Ranger, and serves as an example of just what this generation of veterans have done on our behalf. Well, many of our veterans come home from these wars stronger and wiser for their service and immediate assets to their communities. Many others, unfortunately, bring their wars home with them in the form of psychological injuries that they silently suffer from and often fall into self-destructive, reckless, and unfortunately sometimes violent behavior against the very communities that they once risked their lives to protect. Our goal in this advocacy is to ensure that these folks come home and get the help that they need when we identify them in that need. It's often in the back of a squad car or down at the county jail that we first identify a veteran in need, because so often these folks do not raise their hand and ask for help. And Mr. Milosevic will go into detail about why that is the case. To give you a sense of the scale, the U.S. government released a study in 2012 that found that over 3 million Americans had served in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that roughly 20% of them were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, another 20% or so from traumatic brain injury, and noted that these numbers are almost certainly on the low side because so few of these veterans suffering these injuries initially seek help on their own or even report their problems. The same study noted that these conditions, if not properly diagnosed and treated, can lead to criminal conduct and can lead to criminal behavior against these communities that they sought to serve. History tells us that the number of troubled veterans from this generation coming into the courts is going to continue to swell for several more years. Historical research confirms veteran crime waves following every major American conflict. The best data on this comes from the Vietnam War, and studies done by the U.S. government in the years after the war confirmed that large numbers of Vietnam veterans had contact with the criminal court system. A study done by the VA in the mid-1980s found that over half of the veterans it was treating for PTSD had been arrested at least once, more than a third had been arrested 2 or more times, and nearly 12% convicted of felonies just in the first decade after the Vietnam War. And Department of Justice studies have shown that that lingering effect has endured for many years following Vietnam. As of 1998, the DOJ found that there were still hundreds of thousands of Vietnam veterans in the criminal justice system, in continuing to cycle back again and again and again. So the question we now face in our criminal courts today, here in Minnesota and across the country, is what do we do with this new generation of veterans coming home whose criminal offenses are tied to their military service and untreated conditions? Do we repeat mistakes made in the past, demonizing and discarding another generation of veterans as we did those before it? Or do we pursue a more informed approach, harnessing our newfound knowledge of combat trauma to use a criminal justice contact as an intervention opportunity to ensure troubled veterans receive the help they need and become assets rather than ongoing liabilities to their communities? Though Minnesota has long been at the forefront, as I mentioned, in criminal justice reform in the way we deal with veterans, I fear that we're beginning to fall behind. Many other states now have really jumped on board with this trend and are creating veterans courts at a high rate of speed, whereas Minnesota currently only has 7 of our 87 counties with some form of veteran treatment court. We can and we need to do better. Our goal in this appropriation is to really put Minnesota back at the forefront, to make us the first state in the country that has some form of a veteran court approach in every jurisdiction, that every judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, public defender, police officer, probation officer in the state is educated on the need and educated on the resources available, both state and federal, to make sure that we take advantage of a criminal justice intersection as an intervention opportunity and help this generation be the next greatest generation. And as I wrap up, I would address one footnote, and that is that there have been some concerns voiced to us among some legislatures about whether our appropriation and our mission overlaps with or contradicts the mission of the Minnesota Assistance Council for Veterans, MACV. I can assure you that's not the case. The Veterans Defense Project has a long symbiotic relationship with MACV. MACV provides civil legal services for veterans, whereas ours focuses on criminal justice, education, and advocacy. The Veterans Defense Project has for many years provided attorney volunteers at stand-down to provide the criminal court component of the stand-down court system. And we are also frequently referred attorneys by MACV who are seeking assistance and advice on dealing with veterans in criminal cases. We would like to continue that symbiotic relationship and go forward. And with that, I will turn over the floor to Pete Orpett, Washington County Attorney and Marine veteran.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, and I want to thank Commissioner Detmer for having me here too, and you, Vice Chair. I'm Pete Orpett. I'm the Washington County Attorney. I've been a prosecutor for over 30 years. I served active duty Marine Corps as well as several years in the Army Reserve, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I've come to rely on Brock Hunter, Ryan Else, and a number of other people to help me do the right thing in criminal court, because unfortunately there are hundreds, maybe thousands of wonderful veterans like Marko Milosevic, whom you'll hear, that end up coming through our criminal justice system. And I'm reminded that these gentlemen, and women as well, didn't go in the service as a criminal, and I would never see them but for some of the multiple deployments, indefinite times in combat, and they come back and of course they self-medicate, and sooner or later they and I meet. I've relied on Brock Hunter for one big thing, to get a veterans court in Washington County. When I was elected in 2011, first thing I did was set up a veterans diversion program for, again, folks like Marko. We've screened 72 people, including 2 women who were victims of military combat trauma, sexual trauma. And if not for the Veterans Defense Project, I wouldn't have gotten my project up, and that would be 72 people who wouldn't have got the same kind of attention and justice. It's all about doing the right thing to the right person. That's how we view it in our office. And we need folks like the Veterans Defense Project to educate our bench and us to get it right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and continue with your testimony.
Thank you, Representative O'Neill and committee members, for allowing me the opportunity to be here. My name is Marko Milosevic, and I am the face of the veteran that Brock Hunter was referring to. I'm going to start just giving you a brief background of myself and the nature of my service. I joined the Army. I was 17 years old, and I joined in April of 2001, right before 9/11. I was just planning on doing my 4 years and collecting my GI Bill and getting out of the service. When 9/11 happened, I was in training going to airborne school. I had just graduated from the basic infantry course. Shortly after airborne school, the Ranger recruiter came around, and I was 18 at that point, and they needed more members to join the 75th Ranger Regiment because we were deploying shortly. I went through the Ranger Assessment Selection Program, which back then was called the Ranger Indoctrination Program, or RIP. Upon completion of that, I was on a probationary status at the 75th Ranger Regiment, and I deployed for my first time, not even having completed all my training. When I returned home, I finished U.S. Army Ranger School, and I've been to numerous different schools throughout the United States military, some in an official capacity and some not in an official capacity as a member of the Joint Special Operations Commander, JSOC. I did 12 combat deployments, and each time I came home from those deployments, I felt less and less a part of this world. I was 17 years old, and I saw the world in black and white, and I had one tool in my toolbox to solve my problems, and that tool was violence. That's the only tool you need when you're in a war. And at the age of 31, I was medically separated from the military due to wounds and injuries sustained in combat, which is another difficult thing for somebody to process. I didn't choose to leave the game. The game kind of chose to leave me, and that was a hard thing to deal with, a hard pill to swallow. So at the age of 31, having existed my entire adult life in war or training to go to war, I was released into the world with a handshake and an attaboy and an American flag from the military, and I was pretty disillusioned. I still saw the world in black and white, and I still had that same tool in my toolbox. And I got into some trouble. I drank more than I should have. I was using drugs and trying to cope with all of my issues. And I wound up landing myself in the Beltrami County Jail, and I was facing a third-degree felony assault. Which point in my life I met Mr. Hunter here. And it was because of him as my defense attorney and as a phenomenal lawyer, and now somebody I consider a mentor in life, has really stuck their neck out for me and gave me an opportunity to turn it all around. Since then, I've attended Bemidji State University, Representative Detmer's alma mater, and I just moved down here to Forest Lake. I am currently attending Metro State University, and due to all the work I've been doing, I have a 4.0 GPA, and Metro State University is giving me the opportunity to actually write my own curriculum in an independent studies course. I'm thinking about setting something up, since veterans are a subculture in our society, thinking of kind of modeling it after other subgroups in our society, kind of like Native American studies or gender studies. I'm thinking about doing something along the lines of a veteran studies undergraduate. I have aspirations of going to law school, and I was just recently contacted by members of the Tillman Scholarship to fill out an application in which they would help offset my costs for law school. The goal is to go to St. Thomas. But again, if it wasn't for these veterans courts or these intervention opportunities, I would have had the book thrown at me. And we know through the research that Brock's done in his book that almost 80% of veterans returning home from combat will struggle with alcohol abuse, drug addiction, domestic violence, or run-ins with the law of some sort or another. And we also know that if we throw the book at these combat veterans, the recidivism rate is far higher than that of the average everyday citizen. And I ask judges all the time if they've ever thanked a veteran for their service, or sheriffs if they've ever thanked a veteran for their service. And they always say, of course. And I said, well, then here's an opportunity to really thank veterans for their service and give them a second chance that they deserved, since they served our country in an honorable capacity. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.
Mr. Milosevic, thank you so much for your service. Thank you for your testimony today. I also am a Bemidji State grad, along with you and the chair. And I actually was the member that pushed specialty courts to be allowed across the entire state. So all 87 counties are now eligible to have a specialty court. And I've been a couple times on the veterans courts nearby. So I couldn't agree more. And we have some member questions with that.
Fantastic.
Representative May-Quade.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for your testimony and for bringing this to the committee. I just wanted to say to all of you and to Representative Detmer, as we continue to look at ways to decrease the racial disparities in Minnesota and deal with criminal justice in a different way, this does both things, and it's a really, really good bill, and I'm so glad to be signed on to it and to support it today, and thank you so much for coming and giving your testimony, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative O'Driscoll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great testimony by everyone. And Mr. Milosevic, welcome home.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be home.
And thank you for your service to the people of our country. Your story strikes me in somewhat of a personal manner. 17 years old, 31 years old, just in the prime of your life, and your chosen career of 14 years has been, rugs been pulled out from underneath you on that for some things that are probably not of your making or your design. Please, if I'm getting too personal, just tell me and I'll back off on that.
No.
When your separation from the U.S. Selective Services, did you receive any VA benefits from as a result of your injuries that you received, sir?
Absolutely. Currently, I am, according to the VA, I am 100% permanent and total disabled. And then I also receive what's called a combat-related special compensation, essentially due to no fault of my own, because I couldn't complete my 20-year enlistment, but I had shown the intent to do so. They went through my VA disability packet, and they have assessed that 100% of what is in my VA disability packet is directly attributable to wounds sustained in combat. Therefore, they basically gave me 100% of what my retirement would have been at my current rank I was, which is, I believe that's how it all shakes out. There's a lot of math that I over my head, so, but yeah.
Representative O'Driscoll.
Thank you. Mr. Milosevic, just a couple of follow-ups on that. Were you also eligible then for education benefits through your GI Bill, and are you also eligible as a discharged veteran, honorably discharged, but due to your disabilities, eligible for care full-time through the VA Medical Center?
Mr. Milosevic.
Yes, sir. I am currently using my Chapter 31 post-9/11 GI Bill benefits, which is really, I'm grateful that the Department of Defense decided I joined under the Montgomery GI Bill program, but they gave the option to the vet to use either or, and the post-9/11 GI Bill program has been the best fit for me. Also, I do receive ongoing care at the Veteran Affairs in St. Cloud. I have a great primary care doctor up there, and I've had nothing but good things to say about the VA. As a matter of fact, I often mentor younger veterans, and I do volunteer at the VA from time to time. A lot of veterans have chips on their shoulder when they get out, and I always tell them a few pieces of advice. You know, don't go to the VA wearing ripped up clothing. Put on a pair of slacks, tuck your shirt in, like we used to do in the military. Yes sir, no sir. And it's not the healthcare provider's fault if things are broken within the VA system. I think everybody knows that there are problems with the VA system, but those are often at administrative levels. So I try to tell them to, you know, you'll get more flies with honey, essentially, than with vinegar, and hopefully change some of their minds about the VA a little bit.
Mr. Milosevic, one final question for you. I have authored a bill for the last several years that's having to do with providing law enforcement officials with additional money and training on de-escalation training.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing your story today, think that you might be a candidate who might have had their life saved as a result of that kind of training. And again, just to give you a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with it, or others who are at the committee today, this is to provide special skills and training for law enforcement officials who, when they may come to a situation that's a domestic situation or other, that there's a veteran on the other side of that, that they understand the issues and that they understand the specialized training that people may have and the pressure that might be on the other side of the door before law enforcement enters to deal with that. Would you have comments as to whether or not you think that that would be something that would have been helpful for you or has been helpful for you in situations you might have found yourself in? And if you think that that's something that the Minnesota State Legislature should continue to fund? Again, if any of those questions are too personal, I fully understand.
No,
Milosevic.
Thank you. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got post-military was from this man right here, and he told me to embrace my narrative, and I have. And instead of, you know, running or shirking from my story, I totally embrace it, and I found that being open and honest and candid about my story gives other veterans the ability to look at me and look at the nature of my service and give them a little bit of hope. And part of what I do myself is when I was up in Bemidji, I from time to time visit the Beltrami County Jail, and I try to speak with other veterans and give them, ask them for one if they're getting their VA benefits, and if they're not, we try to do the paperwork right there in the jail, because let's be frank, they're not going anywhere for a little bit, and just give them sort of a light at the end of the tunnel speech. And I know for me, when I was in the Beltrami County Jail, spending the weekend in there and kind of contemplating my life and what landed me there, I had the opportunity to speak to a few corrections officers who are still members of the Minnesota National Guard, the Red Bulls. And they actually went and spoke to the judges on my behalf before I even went to my bail or my arraignment hearing. And just as veterans, they were knowledgeable about me and my situation, and actually took the opportunity to speak to a judge on my behalf, and I was released on my own recognizance, which is almost unheard of for any sort of felony charges. And those guys intuitively knew how to do it because they were veterans. And I can see much added benefit. I know a fellow veteran, Hector Maticastillo, who would probably vouch for de-escalation training within the law enforcement. I very much think it would be beneficial, and if there's any assistance you need or input from myself, I'd be more than willing to help you with that.
All right, we're going to move on. Representative Pryor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple questions I have, if that's permitted. And first of all, just a comment that I would like to say that I am grateful to hear your testimony today and to learn your narrative, to hear this information. The first question I have is, I'm hearing in this request for additional funding that you want to expand out and reach more counties. Is that correct?
Representative O'Neill, members of the commission, yes. We have been working for years doing our best to educate criminal justice professionals across the state on these issues, and we've reached quite a few. But like a lot of the veterans that we work with, we've not always been the best at asking for help and assistance. And we've been doing everything that we've been doing up to this point unfunded, unsubsidized. And as I said, I see a great need that we've done a lot of good work here in Minnesota, but there's so much left to do. Only 7 of our 87 counties have some kind of programming like this. And though I've spoken to hundreds of criminal justice professionals across the state, there are thousands and thousands more that have not heard the message. And even those who have heard our message have heard usually just a little piece, an hour or an hour and a half of what we can do. And we can provide much more comprehensive, intensive training that will help all of these jurisdictions come up to speed. So yes, we need, in order to continue what we've been doing and to expand it to the level that it really should be expanded, we need some additional help in order to do this on a more systemic and formalized manner.
Representative Pryor, follow-up.
Thank you. The next question I have is actually something I asked when we were talking about the training with law enforcement is, you know, if we're talking about illnesses as a result of combat service, and if we're talking about addictions probably also relating to that illness, the kind of work that you're doing, are you in conversation with other groups that are working with individuals with mental illnesses and with addictions in our criminal justice system?
Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Representative O'Neill. Representative Pryor, yes. I, for many years, served as the legislative chair for the Minnesota Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and have pushed a lot of different issues that deal with mental health and criminal justice system. Very familiar and have good working relationships with NAMI and other groups here in Minnesota that are working on these issues. And I've also come to see the veterans issue as the proverbial foot in the door, so to speak, in the criminal court system to help the justice system understand and embrace the way that mental illness plays a major role in a lot of offenses among veterans and non-veterans alike. And that oftentimes it's veterans garner more sympathy and understanding among a lot of folks. And if we can understand mental health issues in their capacity, I have hope that on a larger scale, the justice system can come to understand the way that mental health plays a role in criminal offenses in general. Yeah.
Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my question is also for Mr. Hunter. And I was wondering, I also serve on the Public Safety Committee, and we've recently heard from the public defenders. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you think the funds would potentially be allocated. You talked about education, outreach, and legal assistance. And so I'm just curious how much of that is going to go to direct representation.
Mr. Hunter.
And to be clear, none of this funding would be going to direct representation of veterans. I don't think that's even allowed under the rules here in Minnesota. But it would go extensively to training, first and foremost, public defenders and private criminal defense attorneys who are going to be representing veterans in the coming years. As I said, have already been doing a lot of that work unsubsidized and have spoken in front of probably most of the public defenders in the state, but usually in a shorter presentation to just give them a taste of what we're dealing with and how they can deal with it in the courts. In an ideal situation, we would put every public defender in the state through a more comprehensive training program, and that is contemplated within the appropriation we're talking about here, as well as providing similar training to the private defense bar, but also judges, prosecutors, police officers, and probation officers. Anyone in the system that is dealing with veterans, we'd like to get our message in front of them and help them understand how they can use available resources that are already out there to do a better job.
Thank you. And yeah, just a quick follow-up. So I just wanted to clarify what the legal assistance idea was in the appropriation.
And Madam Chair,
Representative
just to make it clear that the bill appropriates, the $350,000 per year, and it then is appropriate to the Department of Veterans Affairs for grants to be given out as grants. So the money would be, the oversight is with the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you, Mr. Orpett and Mr. Hunter, for the work you did on the statute requiring combat trauma to be considered in sentencing. Who carried that bill for you when you brought it up? Do you remember?
I believe it was Senator Mahoney, in the House, or Representative Mahoney in the House, and I am struggling. It's been so many years, I can't recall in the Senate.
That's fine. Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just curious, because it's little things like that that we can pass around here, and bills like this, all the stuff that you've done, all the things that Mr. Orpett has done, is enabled by an atmosphere in the public that generally likes and appreciates veterans to the extent they understand it. I mean, the public looks at the military and veterans as monolithic, that inured to their detriment after Vietnam and inures to their benefit now in the wake of the War on Terror. But it causes me to think, after World War II, I'm a fan of watching old reruns TV shows, and in the 50s and 60s, those old TV shows, all kinds of military references to chain of command, whether you're talking about Star Trek or something, because the general public kind of understood and got the nature of military command and what happened. You don't see that much anymore on mainstream TV shows, because where almost 20% of the nation wore the uniform at some point in the 40s, now we've got less than 0.5% fighting our wars. So it causes me to wonder, how soon will this goodwill wave upon which we are riding to enable bills like this, the other bill you passed, how soon will that fade? And what happens when it does fade? So we can do this now, and that's excellent. But at what point what do we need to do to sustain that so that people understand it, especially when, in the 50s, everybody knew someone in their family who served. Now, it's really hard to get that. So that's my question for you. And then the other request I'd make is, Mr. Milosevic, when you do that undergraduate program, I would be really intrigued to see if a component of it involved anything like that.
Mr. Milosevic.
Absolutely, and it's good to see you again. I don't know if you remember, I sat at your table during the Medal of Honor convention. That's right. Yeah, I was like, I know him, and I just remembered. Could you repeat your question, though, Representative?
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If the goodwill that enables legislation like this fades in subsequent years, first of all, how do we sustain it to get people to really understand what it is like to go through what veterans do, like you did? And then what do we do if it does fade? What happens to us then?
Mr. Hunter.
Representative Left, that is the challenge before us. In these conflicts, we've done that without the draft. And as you said, less than 1% of our nation have been in uniform during these conflicts. Less than half of that 1% have deployed to the two longest wars in our country's history, fought simultaneously. It's really an unprecedented situation we face, with a small generation of veterans coming home who've served and sacrificed in many ways like none other before them. And the public really is in many ways apathetic and disconnected towards the sacrifices made by this generation. And I think it's a challenge that we need to face on many fronts. I do think that this appropriation and helping educate the justice system and all of its stakeholders will go a long way to ensuring this generation of veterans receives the respect and the constructive approach that they deserve to move on with their life and become assets and not ongoing liabilities in their communities. But I think it's going to take a multi-tiered approach to keep the public engaged and informed and empathetic to what we are calling on this generation of veterans to do. And it's something that everyone in this room, I think, is going to have to take part in if we're going to succeed.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter.
If I could just add, Madam Chair and Representative Lesh, I think what we saw after Vietnam is the public blamed the troops for the policymakers' decisions. So troops were treated poorly after Vietnam. And now I think we've come as a society to where we understand the policymakers and the troops are completely different. Let's not blame the troops for political decisions made by policymakers. And I think that's why we've seen such goodwill towards veterans, but I don't take it for granted, and it could be gone tomorrow.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. This is a public hearing. Are there any members of the public that would like to testify for or speak, have concerns with the bill? Okay, seeing none, we have the author's final comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I think this is another example of what Minnesota is in the process of doing to make Minnesota a better place for our veterans as they come back and reintegrate into our society and go on with their careers and their family life. And I like to mention to people that are involved in this, if most of us speak with one voice, things will get done. So, Madam Chair, I again move that we re-refer State House File 505 to the State Government Committee on State Government Finance.
Okay, Representative Detmer renews his motion that House File 505, as amended, be referred to the State Government Finance Committee. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion prevails.